Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Brookings Doha Center's webinar on the 10th anniversary of the so-called Arab Spring. This is the wave of social unrest that spread across the Arab region in 2011 and continues to reverberate across the region to this day. Please begin by muting at the bottom of your screen original audio because this webinar is being broadcast simultaneously in English and Arabic. Select English for English and French for Arabic. The event will be an hour and 15 minutes long, and you can submit your questions on the Q&A. So 10 years ago, Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor's self-immolation sparked the Tunisian Revolution and the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring unfolded across the region like a tsunami. Autocrats fell in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Major government and constitutional changes were undertaken in Jordan, Oman, Morocco, Kuwait, and Palestine. Some of these changes were lasting, as in the case of Tunisia. In other countries like Jordan, Morocco, the changes were more superficial and aimed at easing social unrest. A third group of countries, including Egypt and Bahrain, early advances in political freedoms were soon replaced by increased repression and control. And finally, in a fourth group of countries, including Libya, Syria, and Yemen, civil war erupted and continues to this day. Since 2011, protests and unrest have continued across the region. In 2019 alone, there have been massive protests in Algeria, Iraq, Sudan, and Lebanon. Furthermore, the underlying social, economic, and political factors that led to the Arab Spring continue to drive unrest across the region. The high rates of youth unemployment that were prevalent 10 years ago continue to this day and average between 25 and 30% across the region. This compares to the global average of around 12 to 13%. Real GDP per capita across the region has been lackluster and has grown at less than 1% per year. Finally, in terms of transitions, Tunisia really is the only country that has moved from being to being a free country in terms of freedom and democracy. So to discuss these issues and to discuss where we stand with regard to these past 10 years and where the region is going, we are joined today by a group of eminent scholars on the Arab region. José Bahout is the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University Beirut. Lina Khatib is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. And Michele Dunne is the director of the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Joseph, let me start with you. Why did the first wave of uprisings that spread across the country fail? And really, what are the takeaways from the past 10 years?
Thank you, Nader. Thank you for hosting this very important event. I think you have at least the advantage of being the first center doing an event on the 10 years anniversary of Arab Revolution. I think we will have a flurry of webinars and events on that next year. So congrats for being so quick and so reactive. I salute also my good friends, Lina and Michele, and my former colleagues at Carnegie. To answer your question, I think it's interesting to go across the geography, I think, of the first wave of Arab revolts. Very quickly, maybe we can have a typology, maybe according or related to 3 or 4 criterias that explain why here it worked relatively, like in Tunisia, as you said, and there it really didn't work and went into complete catastrophe, like in Syria or in Libya. I would choose, and this is arbitrary, of course, and insufficient. I hope my colleagues will add to that 2 or 3 criterias of success and non-success. One is the nature probably of the state and the political system. The other one has to do with the nature of society and its fabric. And the third one has to do with the geopolitical context. On the first level, the state apparatus and its construction In countries like maybe Tunisia and Egypt, relatively, you have I mean, despite everything and albeit everything, you have a kind of republican tradition. The state is not completely perceived as fully patrimonial and fully sultanic or regime focus. I mean, there is a tradition of state apparatus in Egypt, despite everything. There is a tradition of republicanism and constitutionalism in Tunisia, whereby in countries like Syria or in Yemen or elsewhere, or Libya, the state structure and the power structure is much more crude power, fear state, and sultanic politics, I would call it. Society is also an interesting factor. In Egypt, Tunis, and Tunisia, you have more or less a homogeneous society, at least if you take the religious sectarian component, whereby in Syria or elsewhere, Syria is a complete mosaic, where the division of society completely and very easily plays in the hand of the state structure in its counter-revolutionary, let's say, strategies and tactics. So it's easy to divide the social body and the social structure and the social fabric. In Syria along sectarian or ethnic lines, in Libya along tribal lines and regional lines. So it plays much easier in the hands of the authoritarian counter-revolution strategy. The last point is, I think, maybe the most important 10 years after, because this is where we are today, in this kind of new Cold War in the region, it's the geopolitical aspect. Tunisia was, I mean, with all, it's not at all a pejorative expression I will use, but Tunisia was kind of unuseless for its neighbors. I mean, Tunisia could succeed or not, it wouldn't change the geopolitics of the Maghreb, whereby Syria really shifting from one nature to another, from one structure to another, would have shifted a lot of equilibriums and balance of power in the region. Libya maybe is a little bit more like that, Bahrain definitely, and other places. So everybody in the surrounding, in the neighborhood, has a vested interest in meddling in this process. First, the close neighbors like Turkey and Iran in Syria, and the remote neighbors, the US, China, Russia, of course, etc., which led these countries to become, in fact, very quickly the arena of proxy competition between regional and international powers. And what added to that is the point two, the division of society that was also a very welcoming structure for these interventions and mingling. So very quickly, these are, I think, some of the criteria we could reflect upon to say why it worked there and why it didn't work there. Now, 10 years later, I think that the new wave of revolutions, we'll talk about them in a minute probably, or in some time, the new waves of revolution, Lebanon, Algeria, maybe Iraq, as of 2018, are a bit different, and we will probably try to say why. But I think that the net result of the 10 years before, I mean, the first wave of the revolution, is that really geopolitics probably superseded and aborted most of the tracks that were at play in front of our eyes.
Thank you, Joseph. So for the audience, Joseph is coming to us from Beirut, where the internet isn't always that reliable. And so we're going to just wait a little bit sometimes when he freezes to make sure that we catch the comments. I'm getting some questions from the audience about language translation. If you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on the language, you have to select English for English and French for Arabic. And then you have to put mute original so that you can only hear one. Sorry about that. Lina, turning to you, actually, Tunisia is a bit of the silver lining right now. It's the poster child for the potential success, shall we say, of the Arab Spring, and where you could see success coming in the future. So why is that, and what are the factors that have maybe contributed to its successful transition so far?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Tunisia is right now the only country from all the places that witnessed the uprisings that is actually heading in the direction of democratization. And there are many factors that explain this. One is that the political parties in Tunisia, whether existing political parties or people who kind of, what I mean by that is political figures who had existed before the uprisings and kind of started to play a political role later, as well as emerging political figures in the country and their parties, all of them seem to have relatively quickly realized that political pragmatism is the way to go, and that they have to cooperate with those they may not necessarily entirely agree with. And this is how the country moved from witnessing shortly after 2011 a standoff between Ennahda and Nidaa Tunis, which was at the time the major secular party in the country. And I was personally there to witness how late President Essebsi at the time, before he became president, refused to be present even in the same room publicly as Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who was the leader of Ennahda and still is. And they moved from that to a partnership, a few years later. And this is really a very significant development that showed that political pragmatism can transcend ideological political positions. The second factor is that civil society in Tunisia has been very strong and very active, and not just in the country, but also in the diaspora. This gives me hope for today when I look at countries like Syria, where the situation on the ground is indeed very dire. But in the diaspora, we are seeing the emergence of some really talented, skilled voices that are trying to work institutionally. Their time will come. And so Tunisia shows us that just because someone's abroad doesn't mean, they don't play a role in what's happening on the ground. And I'm hoping, Michele can say more about whether there's any hope for Egypt in that regard as well with the diaspora. So civil society was important. The fact that women played a very significant and vocal role in Tunisia is also important, because we shouldn't forget that democratization is about inclusivity, and having half a society not participate and not be accounted for is very detrimental. And so in Tunisia, we did not have that, which is very encouraging. The labor unions in Tunisia have been acting as watchdogs in this process. Again, this gives me hope for countries like Lebanon, where political parties coming from outside of the ruling elites are very weak. However, we are seeing, and maybe perhaps Joseph might want to talk about that at some point because he's there. It gives me hope to see unions starting to play a more active role as institutions. And last but not least, when it comes to the positives for Tunisia, perhaps the lack of meddling from external stakeholders should also be taken into consideration. So unlike Syria or Yemen or Libya or Egypt or the other countries where their strategic importance sadly came to haunt them in a negative way because of the interests of foreign powers, Tunisia did not have that. So these are the positives. Of course, Tunisia faces many challenges, economic challenges being a key part, some security challenges as well. But I think these factors that I mentioned that are positive can show us that there are things that other countries can also learn from the Tunisian experience in their own journeys.
Thank you, Lina. Michele, looking back, over the past 10 years, one can get a little bit disillusioned and disheartened. It looks like many of the factors that contributed to the Arab Spring in 2011 continue today. In fact, at least in terms of political participation and democracy, I think a majority of countries actually have fallen behind and are actually in a worse position than they were 10 years ago. So why have Arab states not been able to respond to these fundamental factors? And what does this mean in terms of the next 10 years to come?
Thank you, Nader. Great to be with you and great to be with my fellow panelists. If I might just add one word on Tunisia, since this is the day. I totally agree with what Lina and Joseph have raised in terms of why Tunisia has been able to move forward. And I just wanted to add one more thing, which is the role played, or in some ways not played, by the Tunisian military. So, you know, quite in line with what Lina and Joseph have said, you know, in Tunisia, basically civilians, whether we're talking about political leaders, political parties, civil society groups, labor unions, they've had to muddle through and work it out themselves. And up till now, no one has stopped them from doing that, right? Their own military didn't stop them from doing it. As my fellow panelists said, external actors did not stop them from doing that. And we see they are still doing it now. You know, Lina mentioned the economic challenges. Those are very strong in Tunisia. And, you know, but we still see, you know, basically civilians, you know, struggling through it. It's a painful process to watch, you know, in some ways, and it's been painful for Tunisians, but it's still going on. It's still a going concern. And I think that could have happened in some other countries too, except it was stopped. Right, the painful process, what Lina talked about, having to become pragmatic, having to work out political deals and compromises among different factions or whatever, it's been cut short, or it's been, you know, turned militant, you know, in some countries. So, you know, that's one of the issues. But to your question, Nader, for me, looking at the region, I have to kind of widen the lens, okay, and really move out and say, the way I understand it is there is a massive process of change going on in this region. We've seen 10 years of it so far, and I am pretty sure we will see at least another 10, if not 20, before maybe some kind of a new equilibrium is found. And I'm sure it would also leave the region with a patchwork of different political arrangements. I'm certainly not suggesting that every country will have the same trajectory or the same results. But what I see as at the bottom of it, Nader, is this, that the political economy of the region is changing fundamentally. I mean, we had a huge growth of population in the region, which led to this youth bulge, youth unemployment, some of the economic statistics that you were citing, Nader. And then we have the looming end of the oil and gas era. And my understanding of much of the political basis of this region and why authoritarianism has been so strong, why external powers, including my own country, the United States, have engaged with this region in ways that have been unconstructive in many ways. A lot of it has to do with the oil and gas in the region. And what we're now seeing is that era in which oil and gas reigned supreme, in which the rest of the world needed it strongly and was willing to engage with the region in certain ways, was willing to support authoritarian leaders in order to keep the oil and gas flowing, and in which the leaders themselves were able to buy social peace inside their own countries with these revenues. You know, they're drawing the revenues of the government out of the ground, or in some cases, from political rents that were, you know, in many ways secondary to the oil and gas rents, or sometimes secondary to proximity to Israel, things like that. But either political rents or mineral rents, these governments were largely drawing on. And again, this is a gross generalization, right? We can find exceptions, but I'm just saying in a very general sense, what was driving the region. And the fact that for the most part, citizens either weren't taxing, governments either weren't taxing their citizens or were undertaxing them, and therefore there was really no government accountability to the citizens, right? Which you have a little bit more in cases where citizens are actually funding the government through their taxes. So I'm just saying this is a whole big political economic setup. And what we're looking at now is, you know, the projections that I have seen, Nader, is that global demand for oil and gas will peak and then begin to decline for many reasons. But of course, you know, the renewables now are coming on very strong now after a very slow, long startup. And, you know, I think that there are different projections. Some people think that global demand will begin to fall for oil and gas in 10 to 12 years. Some people think we're already there, and that after the pandemic, it will not return to the level that it was pre-pandemic. Again, I don't want to, this is a slow sunset. It's not going to end overnight, but already there's a global glut in supplies. And we're seeing the fallout from that in place after place in the Middle East, governments struggling. And for the most part, they have failed to build diverse productive economies away from rents of various kinds. And there hasn't been adequate development in many countries of human capital. Now, there are some countries, Tunisia is one of them, and I think Lebanon's one of them. There are some countries that have invested more in human capital and in building economies based on human capital instead of rents. Some have done that more than others. But so that is why I think that the whole area is going to be unstable. There's going to be a lot of change. And it doesn't surprise me, Nader, that the first wave or the second wave of change doesn't bring about immediate success. I mean, look at the rest of the world. Why would we expect countries, you know, that have been under various different kinds of authoritarian rule for a long time to make transitions to participatory accountable government in a couple of years? It hasn't happened elsewhere in the world, so why should it happen in this region? And so, you know, we will, and again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the outcome at the end. I think there are a lot of different potential outcomes, but I do think we're going to continue to see a lot of change. Some of it may be in the form of popular uprisings, as we saw. There may be other forms as well. But the last thing I want to say is, in terms of popular protest, I think the pandemic pressed the pause button on popular protest in this region. But that I think we will see it come back. I think there's unfinished business in a lot of countries. Algeria is one that I would name, for example. And then we probably will see various kinds of change, including perhaps popular protest breaking out in countries that have not seen it yet.
Thanks, Michele. Joseph, so Michele was talking about kind of a shift, a political economy shift that's been taking place in the region, slow moving, and will continue into the future. What do you see as some of the differences between the Arab revolts and the first wave that took place 10 years ago, and the second or new wave that's been taking place now, and in places like in Sudan and Algeria and Lebanon? And maybe you can even spend a bit of time on Lebanon and tell us a little bit about how that's developing.
Mm-hmm. Before getting there, and in order to get there, in fact, I would take 1 or 2 minutes to completely echo and bounce back or rebounce on what Michele just said. And I can't, echo enough what has been said. I think that some metaphors are sometimes cliches, but like all cliches, they are sometimes useful also. I think the best way to historically compare what is happening in the Arab world since 2010 is Europe in 1848 or something like that, meaning a very long span change cycle, cycle of change and transformation in both the political structure, the economic structure, and the social cultural structure also. There is an entire paradigm shift that is in fact at play here. And it is in fact succeeding a frozen era in the Arab world. You know, when we review the literature about the Arab world for the last 40 years, this was probably the image that was probably the most used. It was a region that was completely frozen, desertified, apathetic. These are the words that we often read. And now all of a sudden this region is getting out of the fridge. And as Michele said, it will take time to unfroze and to unfreeze and to take a new shape. So this process is like Europe in 1848, is first a long process. I think those who quickly written the end of the film were a bit hasty and took some risk. saying that the Islamist winter has come after the Arab Spring and etc., and draw some definitive conclusions about that, should maybe revise their calculus. This is a long process. I don't exclude that it will still take some 20 or something like that years. Second, it's a bumpy process. It's a violent process somewhere. Syria is an example. Unfortunately, Libya is another one. And second, it's a non-linear process. I mean that you will have a lot of back and forth. Some surges of authoritarianism, like in Egypt or elsewhere, will be witnessed somewhere else, but this is also not the end of the film. Again, this is maybe one episode or one season in the series, if we want to take this metaphor. So this is the first echo to what Michele has said. Let's brace for the long term. The second echo has to do with the economics, and here I come back to your question. What we witness, and Michele knows it better than anyone, because in fact in Carnegie in 2018 we produced a very interesting wide report on the Arab region called Arab Horizons. And I had the privilege with my colleagues then to write the political economy chapter of this. And we could see that, in fact, we are closing a cycle in the Arab world in terms of political economy for now a long time. The rentier state, which is direct in the Gulf and indirect elsewhere, meaning the labor market that is benefiting from the oil boom and sucking or absorbing the deficit in job production in countries like Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, etc. A deficit in job creation that was in fact absorbed by the demand in the Gulf states because of the oil boom. This is something that is, I think, gone forever or almost forever. And this is in addition to what Michele was saying. This brings us to issues that are not always perceived on the radar, like educational systems, like social education, social awareness. Today, if we are heading towards a post-rentier economy in the Arab world, it means that the entire way with which we are producing our labor, our brains, our human capital has to be revised thoroughly. Of course, as Michele said, in the direction of a more productive economy, and this is exactly one of the things Lebanon is struggling with. Lebanon used to export something like 80,000 to 100 engineers and skilled labor to the Gulf almost every 5 years or so. Today, this is a closed business. It's a closed market. So Lebanon has to create jobs. In order to create jobs, it has to produce things, whatever these things are: fruits, manufactured goods, high tech, intelligence economy, not intelligence, knowledge economy, and etc. So these are the domains of the future. And I think, and this is what our study then highlighted, our educational systems all across the Arab world are completely today unadapted to that, and they have to be thoroughly revised. This is also an additional way of saying that this is a very long term in terms of history, but also a very deep in terms of structures change in the Arab world. Everything has to be thought again. Not only the superstructure of political power, not only the economic infrastructure, but also the way we are perceiving the generations to come on the forefront of the social scene, the way we are training them and forming them, and the way we are inserting the Arab world in this famous globalization again. Now, on the last point on economy, I think that if we single out only one factor, but it's only one factor, there are others, to say and to reiterate again this truth that this is a long process and it won't end now. At least it won't end because it has not answered the structural underpinning, which is the economic shortcoming. The Arab states were in a complete decay before the Arab Revolution. It has been decades that these structures were comatose, in fact, living on a kind of artificial lifeline. Now this is over, the agony is there, the almost death is there. And as long as these power structures cannot answer the basic needs of citizens, the cause roots of the root causes of what caused the Arab revolt in 2010, this cycle will not end. You asked me about Lebanon. Lebanon today is completely collapsed. We are not heading towards collapse. We are in the middle of collapse. I think we are starting to fall from the cliff. I think we're in the middle of something. We're heading towards very bleak and dark days. This is a country that has, in fact, in a way, embodied a lot of dysfunctionings of the Arab economic system. It was a very indirect rent state, completely living on the remittances of expats, completely living on the investment of Arab Gulf sheikhs and emirs who were spending their special holidays in Lebanon. We were living on a real estate bubble. We were living on a financial bubble that was created, this famous Ponzi scheme, and etc. All this is today completely irreparable. We cannot get back to that. And this is a country, as Michele said, and this is the paradox of some Arab states, that has a huge human capital. I mean, we have some of the best universities. I'm proud of being at one of them. We have very skilled labor and talents that are exported abroad, but we don't produce anything. And we don't even produce a political system that is functioning, even not a political system, an administrative system, a public service providing system. We're not producing it. So all this has to be thought back again, thought off again, and it will take something like 10 years. First of all, to exit from the cliff, to exit from this hole in which we are, then to start making the balance sheet of what remains in the country, and then envisaging and constructing the future for the half century ahead. This is a huge project. This is an enormous working site that will probably swallow 2 generations. But the choices of today are crucial for the outcomes of tomorrow. And this is why maybe we can be, and I think we all 4 are, a bit pessimistic, because we don't even see today the slightest, let's say, glimmer of light and hope, and seeing that the elites, be them political or economic or financial in Lebanon, because the banking system has been a criminal banking system, I say it without any hesitation, has failed the Lebanese people. They cheated on people, and these elites today don't give the slightest sign of awareness, of acknowledgement of what they did. And this is why I think that we unfortunately will have to wait for other shocks and future shocks in order for the therapy to start making its effects.
So Lina, I find myself, I mean, this is an amazing discussion, very deep and insightful. And I find myself both optimistic that we are at kind of partway through a very long-term process that will take time to evolve and to address these fundamentals. And at the same time, pessimistic, because when you start looking at the details at any particular point in time, you might get this, disappointed that, or you find it very difficult to imagine how you can untie this Gordian knot that our countries in the region are dealing with. So how do you feel about this? What is your sense about the success so far and the potential for the future?
Actually, I'm going to cite a recent survey that The Guardian just wrote about today. The Guardian commissioned with YouGov a survey in the region, surveying just over 5,200 people. And they basically asked them, do you think things are now worse off since the uprisings? And do you regret that the uprisings have happened? The results of the survey show that in Yemen and Syria, which are, of course, the 2 countries perhaps most affected in terms of conflict, people do say actually things are worse and that they regret that the uprisings have happened. But in the rest of the region, where uprisings did happen, interestingly enough, despite all the challenges, people are saying, actually, we don't regret that the uprisings have happened. Even in a place like Egypt, the question about whether they think things are worse off, the majority of people said either things are more or less the same or actually a bit better. Even if you look at the situation in Egypt and see that there are a lot of challenges, there is, a bit of hope. And interestingly, when you break down the survey and see who are actually these optimistic people who are skewing the results in this way, it's actually the younger people. So the older people are more hesitant. The older generation are seeing doom and gloom. But as the region is mostly composed of young people, it is these young people that are saying, yes, we know things are difficult, but we don't regret it. And they are less hesitant about change than their parents. So the parents are definitely more pessimistic. Now, of course, when we look at the young people and their own capacity to use this optimism to create change, this becomes a different conversation, because unfortunately, they are not the ones leading their countries right now. They are, for the most part, and again, Tunisia being, a distinct exception here, for the most part, they are unable to drive change forward right now, because these young people have not created political parties that are contesting elections and winning. They are still being thrown in jail for expressing themselves. They are still unable to shake the entrenched political systems that are dominated by these elites. But I always say, and here I echo what Michele has been saying, it is these young people that in 10 or 20 years, these are the people who will be the leaders of the region. So I think for us, it's early days to say the Arab Spring was a failure. For me, this is too soon when it comes to such a judgment. We need to let these young people have their moment, and their moment will come. What gives me hope is that we ultimately live in a globalized world. These people are exposed to what's happening elsewhere in this universe of ours, and are seeing that there is another way, whereas their parents may not have had that opportunity. The, of course, presence of the media in our lives through social media and the internet makes this very easy for people to see that there is an alternative. We don't have to settle for what we have. So right now, they don't have the skills, but they're working on it. I think, again, even a country that is so gloomy as Lebanon right now, when I look at the student elections at universities in Lebanon and see that the three major universities in the country, LAU, AUB, and USG, the secular candidates in student elections won most seats than any others. This gives me hope, because this is unprecedented in the history of the country. So that's why my hope remains that the young people who are young today and will be old, in 10, 20 years time, these are the people who will bring about change. So I am not totally optimistic. I am, of course, very realistic about where we are right now. Things are not looking good, but I think all hope is not lost.
Thanks, Lina. Michele, you mentioned the pandemic in your talks, and obviously the countries of the region have been dealing with this, and for some it's been like pushing a pause button and allowing them to kind of think through some of the governance structures and some of the transitions with their citizens. And for others, like in the Gulf, as you know, it let's say accelerated the decline of oil and gas prices, and again put to the forefront the issues that you mentioned, reaching peak demand and the implications for what they have to do in terms of diversification. Do you see countries across the region using this past year of a pandemic to kind of test out the governance structures, learn what's working, and kind of reflect on what they could do better? And we have many cases where you might see that, like in Jordan, where you had an initial lockdown that prevented the spread of COVID, but then there was a trade-off there, and they went basically from an off button to an on button, and now they're suffering with the consequences rather than maybe take a more nuanced approach. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so first of all, I mean, in terms of how to contain the pandemic and eventually end it, the whole world, including my country, the United States, has just struggled mightily with this. I will say for the Middle East, North Africa region, with the exception of Iran, which was hit very hard by the pandemic initially. The rest of the region, yes, is suffering with the pandemic, but in some ways, at least up till now, it hasn't hit as hard in terms of the numbers of people getting sick and the numbers of people dying and everything as it has elsewhere. There's a second wave now, and it's difficult. But in terms of, Nader, what you're asking about the impact on governance and so forth. Look, the pandemic is, as tragic as it is on the human level and as costly as it is on the economic level, what it is doing across the world, and as I said, including in the United States, is it sheds a harsh spotlight on things like economic inequity, maldistribution of income and so forth. Obviously, we see in a situation like the pandemic how vulnerable certain populations, and in the Middle East region, the many, many people in the informal economy have been in many ways very vulnerable to the economic downturn. And then, as you said, Nader, it is an accelerator of trends in some ways. And certainly an accelerator of this trend in which we have moved from an era of oil and gas scarcity, which kept prices high and so forth, to an era of oil and gas glut. And we don't know whether we're gonna go back to scarcity again, or it seems unlikely. So it has accelerated trends. Now, what I want to connect this to is what Joseph was talking about the problem of elite capture of the economies. And again, I want to be, I want to be humble and honest about this. It's a thing that, we're talking about in the United States as well, that there's been, a trend now for decades of the elite monopolizing a bigger and bigger share of wealth and of the economy and so forth, right? It's a problem for us here. But I have to say, I believe in terms of, maldistribution of wealth and income, the Middle East region is one of the worst in the world, if not the worst in the world. Okay, so it's a very severe problem. And as Joseph said, specific to Lebanon, the elites don't acknowledge what they did. The elites are not ready to acknowledge that this isn't going to work anymore, that there has to be a different distribution of economic opportunity. Lina also referred to it in a way, speaking about youth and moving forward. I mean, we have a real problem of lack of opportunity, that the daughters and sons of the elite with their glitzy tech startups and everything, are sort of made to look as though there's a private sector friendly transformation going on in the Arab world. But this applies to very, very few people. It's open to very few people. Okay, and it's a bit of a facade, I think, a bit of a game, and so this is really, I think, what it's about. Now, you asked, is the pandemic going to make people rethink? I have to be honest with you. I'm not so optimistic, whether in the Arab world or even in my own country, about whether people who have that economic power will rethink and just reconsider and give away their power or share out the economic opportunities and wealth willingly. But what I am more optimistic about, again, is what Lina was talking about, is that people and young people in the Arab region and in my own country are pushing and are saying, this doesn't work. Our parents' system, our grandparents' system is not going to work for us, and this has to change, right? And so I realize that's very broad, but I am more of a believer that, things change when people, societies and citizens press for it. I just want to say briefly, there have been some very interesting experiments as to whether one can open up the economy without opening up the political system, without really fundamentally changing this elite capture. I think the Saudi 2030 vision, for example, is an experiment along those lines. And we've seen that it has real weaknesses, because in order to kind of make this happen, the same thing is happening in Egypt in a way. You need to draw in things like foreign investment and so forth. And when you have a very tilted system, like in Saudi Arabia, a very non-transparent system that is in many ways very unfriendly to foreign investment. In Egypt, again, a very non-transparent system, and a system that's very tilted in favor of the military companies and so forth. Then you find that people don't want to invest in systems like that, and therefore you can't bring about your hoped for economic growth without changing in any way the political participation of citizens, or the fundamental leveling of the playing field and fairness in the economy as well as in politics.
Thanks, Michele. So we're turning to some questions from the audience, actually, which mesh with what a lot of what's been said in this discussion. And one question kind of combines a couple of elements here. The first is that we're talking about a very long process. There are ingrained institutional constraints like elite capture, like the political system, that make it difficult to change. And at the same time, as Lina mentioned, there's some optimism among youth. And so one of the participants is asking about that. To what extent, and I guess the question for you, Joseph, to what extent might young people who don't see change coming as fast as they're hoping, which is quite possible given the long time frame we're talking about, will they remain optimistic? Will they find ways around this, or will we see a cycle of increasing frustration and then kind of blowing up, and then this cycle that encourages even radicalization in some cases? So looking at how youth respond to this, kind of the cycle of optimism and pessimism that they may be going through.
Yeah, this is a crucial question. I think Lina has touched upon this in her previous intervention. In fact, what happened so far, I mean, we all know that this region was living under what we used to call the authoritarian pact, meaning that society, you can take care of your own wealth, your prosperity, your money, your leisure sometime if you are in affluent societies like the Gulf ones, but you leave the public space aside, and we take care of that, and we pay you for that. This is the rentier, in fact, authoritarian pact. This today is gone, as we said, is dead, and it's over. So a new kind of, let's say, pact or social pact has to be passed between rulers and ruled, or the elite and the people. And this is where the question of pessimism and optimism comes back. I mean, you know, we're not doing here political science 101, but any process that would ask from society additional efforts like taxation or contribution to the national economy, or to exit from crisis and etc., has to give back in terms of quid pro quo some freedoms and some rights and some participation in the public sphere. And this is where probably Lina is right. This young generation today has no more the luxury not to be in politics. It could have had the luxury not to be in politics some 20, 30 years ago, because you could have lived in your own bubble on internet help also a little bit. You could emigrate in your head, you know, the famous triad of Hirschman of exit, voice, and loyalty. A lot of youth were in fact exiting while staying physically in their countries. But today this is no more possible. Politics and social economic duress are pursuing you and following you at home. They are entering into your bedrooms. So you have to take your destiny in your hands. And this is where, yes, you have a glimpse of optimism. However, having said that, globalization and technologic progress could also help a kind of collective enemy of the youth segment in the Arab world. More and more people, I notice it in my daily life in Beirut, in Lebanon. You could read about that a lot in the Gulf and etc. Live on the virtual space. I mean, they find refuge in the virtual space. Of course, they tend to think that maybe they are participating in a transformational process. A lot of people today, and I personally have this kind of conversation with some students here and there or with youth. They think that posting a fiery opinion on Facebook or making a series of very provocative tweets will change the political order. I mean, this is maybe something, but it's not everything. And definitely it won't bring down crocodile and dinosauric regimes like the one we are struggling with or living under. So I think that this is where probably we have to transform this conceptual optimism into something real. And this is where also the avenues of political participation, collective action, reinventing new forms of doing politics in the Arab world is something that we as researchers to maybe focus a bit more on. I mean, the old forms, political parties, etc., is maybe gone. The new forms are interesting, but they are not enough. They stay at the level of network construction between, youth in Algeria, youth in Lebanon and Egypt, exchanging jokes on their rulers, exchanging memes on Facebook and Twitter, but this won't create a sweeping political movement that will upend and bring down these structures that still have a lot of resources despite the loss of all other resources. They still have the resource of fierceness, and also, and this is what I wanted to say, and I'll take these last minutes to the opportunity to say it, they still count, unfortunately, and this is really what we need to work also on. They still count on the passivity, if not the complicity, and the cowardice of the West and of countries that are supposed to hold high the values of pluralism, democracy, participation, elite circulation, upward mobility, and etc. In fact, probably one of the failures we don't talk enough about is the failure of the West also. You've been reading, like me and like Michele and like Lina, all the reports of the European Union, the World Bank, etc., for 40 years saying, oh, wow, why are these societies so apathetic? Why they don't take their destiny in hand? And once they started doing this, exactly, everybody let them down under many labels. The fear of Islamism, the fear of instability, the fear of whatever you want. All these fears are understandable, but they can't justify the way the West has dealt with the Arab revolutions and the Arab Spring. I'm not mentioning here the Arab Gulf states or others who are by definition counter-revolutionary. We wouldn't have expected anything from these countries, even in Syria, where they appear to be supporting partly the revolution. And these countries will probably be caught up by the next wave. I agree with Michele, in the next wave will probably hit countries that think that they have got away with this. Probably the oil states, because the rent will come back and bite them. This end of political economy structure will come back and bite them in turn. But I would like to focus on the fact that today, when Western countries are always are only or almost only focused on the fear of migration, seeing young Syrians or Kurds or Lebanese or Egyptian or Libyans hitting their shores, it's not enough to put frigates and vessels in order to prevent that. They should come back to their soul, I mean, to their nature, and to what and put money where their mouth was, not is, because it's not anymore. So I think that this is where we also as researchers have the duty to enhance and to put up a dialogue between intellectuals in this part of the world and intellectuals in the northern part of the Mediterranean and the western part of the world in order to talk about this. It's a common future. And you won't be able to stop human pandemics like migrations, refugees, and etc. just only by closing your borders or injecting some additional dollars in state security apparatus and in materiel of suppressing revolts and protests. It needs much more than that. I'm not naive. I'm not calling for what some people used to call for a Marshall Plan or something like that. But this is a matter of national security for the West itself also.
Thanks, Joseph. And this is a very important point that a couple of the participants actually raised in their questions. Lina, can you build on this a little bit more? The role of the West and the US foreign policy, both in the past in terms of Arab Spring and currently and going forward, what role should they be playing?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Joseph that there is a shared responsibility. I think one of the key things that for me is as a source of frustration is how people outside the region look at the region and go, see, the Arab uprisings were a failure. See, things have not changed, as if it's completely the fault of people in the region. Well, yes, a lot of them do, of course, share a burden when it comes to why things have not worked out in a lot of places, the elites being, you know, the key culprits. But let's not forget how the West also contributed to where we are. Tunisia is struggling economically, not just because of domestic challenges, but also because it did not receive adequate support when it needed it the most, immediately in the aftermath of the revolution there. And of course, now things are a bit better when it comes to European Union engagement, but it still needs more. We shouldn't forget that the West itself achieved democratization because there was a Marshall Plan, for example, in Europe. There was a significant level of economic investment going on to allow countries in Eastern Europe, for example, to progress. The Arab world has not enjoyed such a level of support. The second issue is where you also have political inaction, especially in the case of Syria. Again, it's very easy to say, look, the Syrian conflict is unsolvable. But when you look at why there is a conflict in the first place, we can go back to the days of the Obama administration in the United States, when all the right things were said, but none of the right things were done. And for me, this is the main reason why Syria has not resulted in some sort of political transformation. Had there been political will in the United States all the way back then, I think the situation would have been very different in Syria today. We look at Libya and go, oh, but look, even when you had military intervention to get rid of a regime, how come the country, descended into instability? It shows that in this region, damned if you do, damned if you don't. This is the argument I hear a lot. And again, was the intervention in Libya followed up with a comprehensive stabilization plan? It wasn't. And so the West bears a huge responsibility for why the country there is the way it is. I would say a similar thing about Yemen. Again, the uprising in Yemen actually had a lot of positives going for it. But then the West was very complicit in the GCC initiative at the time that killed the revolution in its tracks and kept more or less the same system in place. And it only came back to mainly bite Saudi Arabia when, Ali Abdullah Saleh chose to partner with Al-Qaeda later on. And so a lot of the accusations that are hurled at the Arab world in terms of why it has not succeeded, and these excuses being used to say, well, this Arab world is destined to authoritarianism, so we'd better stick with stability over democracy, because as you can see, nothing really works in this region, actually is completely erroneous when you scrutinize the role of the West in all this. I say this because, especially now, there's a new administration coming in the United States. I have to say, although, of course, incoming President Biden is not Obama, a lot of people in the region are no longer looking for the United States to come and help them in any way. To me, this is actually not a bad thing. I think the days of expecting Western support and rescue are long gone. The people in the region who really want change and want to sacrifice to make it happen, want it to happen regardless of the United States and regardless of the West. And I think this is where the region, frankly, should be heading.
Thank you, Lina. This is actually segues as well into another issue that a couple of participants are asking questions about, and maybe Michele, you can help us think about through this, the issue of human rights. In the past, well, 4 years and possibly even a bit longer, there has been an issue about to what extent Western institutions and global institutions have really, stood up to the issue of human rights and really supported. I mean, every day in the news you hear stories of people who are being taken into custody simply for expressing their opinion or for standing up to authority, or for doing just basically just basically trying to engage. And the repression is actually quite significant, probably in many countries, even more so than it was 10 years ago. Can you reflect on that situation, and maybe even to what extent Western institutions and international organizations have responded or not responded enough, and what they could do going forward to play a better role?
Yeah, well, let me pick up first on what Lina and Joseph have said about the lack of it's not only the lack of adequate Western support, but really the Western engagement with the region during the period of the last 10 years of the uprisings that was really not only inadequate, but in many ways harmful. So I agree with that. And I also agree with what Lina was implying in her last comments. It's not up to the West to bring change to this region. It's up to the people of the region to bring change to their own countries in the way they want. However, what the West should be asking itself is a couple of questions. First of all, is the West building an enabling international environment? We know from studying democratic transitions around the world that an enabling regional and international environment for increased respect of human rights, for the building of democratic systems is an important factor. It's not the only factor, but it is an important one. So I think, this is a time, when we contrast, for example, the way the West tried to build an enabling environment for Central and Eastern European countries after the fall of the Soviet Union to reach democratic systems, when we compare what was done then to what was done, for example, to support the countries of the Arab Spring, there's just no comparison whatsoever. It was an utter failure on the part of the West. And there are many reasons for it, including the 2008 financial crisis, et cetera, but it was a big failure. I think that needs to be re-examined now. The other part of that, which is more difficult, I think, is what is the West doing that actually obstructs the possibility of building of democracy and human rights, in the Arab world. And that's a lot. That's the more difficult part, I think, for countries in the West, like the United States, like France and others, to look at the way their engagement actually works against the building of participatory political systems in this region. And let me just say, in the United States, I think we're going to be facing a big debate in the next year or two as the Biden administration takes office about this. And that is this: the United States wants to diminish its its military presence in the region. But of course, it still has important national security interests in the region. How does it do that? The answer of some countries in the region, and particularly in the Gulf, is what the United States should do is transfer a massive amount of sophisticated arms to the region. Arm your allies to the teeth. That's the way to stabilize the region if the United States wants to bring down its military presence. Well, there are a lot of us, and count me as a skeptic of that's really the way to stabilize the region, okay? But there's a lot of, I do think the United States should diminish its military presence and change the form of its engagement, but I'm not sure that dumping a lot of sophisticated arms on countries that are already carrying out military interventions in other countries in the region, and human rights abuses amounting to war crimes in some cases in Yemen and probably Libya as well, that's a good idea. So let me say that I think that the United States and others, the European allies with which it has been competing for arms sales in this region, France, Germany, Italy, UK. It's not all about Russia and China. It's about us in the West. We need to look ourselves in the mirror and have a conversation amongst ourselves about what we should be doing if we really want to see the Middle East region stabilized and able to make its way to peaceful economic and political transformation. On human rights specifically, there's some good news on that, I think. First of all, in the United States with President-elect Biden, we are seeing that he and his national security team are saying, and I believe they're quite sincere about this, that they're bringing back human rights and support for democracy as a core tenet of American foreign policy in their administration. I think they mean it. And the other good thing is that we are seeing increased tools. Let me just name, of course, we have the Global Magnitsky Act in the United States, and now its equivalent in Europe. And the Biden administration is going to want to work multilaterally. So we have the possibility of the United States and allies in Europe, in North America, et cetera, in Asia, democratic allies around the world working together in some ways on behalf of human rights. There is that possibility. But as we know, there's not an easy, it's not easy, and it's a long road, right? And I think we need to be able to do the easy part of speaking up for human rights and so forth, but to do the hard part too, of looking at ourselves and our complicity with authoritarian regimes and selling them arms and so forth, and say, well, are we willing, because we can't change anybody else's behavior. We can only change our own. Are we willing to do that? Let's see.
Thank you, Michelle. We have enough time probably just for one more round of questions and comments. So please feel free to weigh in on any points or raise any points that you haven't yet that you want to before we end the webinar today. But I'll try to field some questions as well. So the first one actually is asking about one of the things that we sometimes talk about when we talk about the Arab Spring, is that there wasn't really a strong intellectual framework, and the commentator mentioned that even in places like Lebanon, there was more of a leftist framework in the context of the Arab Spring and social justice and stuff like that. I'm not going to comment on the accuracy of that, but the interesting thing is that was there a gap? Did the Arab intelligentsia leave a vacuum unfilled in terms of framing kind of a development path or framing what was happening in the context of a new development paradigm? And is that still missing today? Joseph?
No, I think that, unfortunately, the question is quite short. I think everything we said indicate that no, the ruling elites and be them in office or in other places, like, I said, we talked about the financial elite or academic elites and etc., have been quite lazy, living on this facility or this easiness of living on a system that was completely fed by either the oil rent or political rents of other natures. So I think that this is also a way of maybe today, not making let's say not putting these people on trial, but also acknowledging that this was really a history of collective failure. Several countries have completely reshuffled their educational system and their university system after staunch defeats or really setbacks. I'm thinking about France in 1870, or other countries, or England in England after World War I or World War II, where you had really institutions that were created on the ruins of certain systems. Lina probably knows it. LSE was created just because, in fact, the British system acknowledged that the elites in Great Britain were unable to cope with certain world challenges. So this is exactly what is needed today in the Arab world, and I would answer very shortly and very quickly that no, there is no enough awareness and let's say willingness to think ahead and to think outside the box of what has been already done so far.
Thanks, Joseph. Lina, same with you. If you have any last comments you want to make, one of the questions that are, a couple of the questions are actually addressing the issue of Western countries and to what extent, you know, their incentives kind of align, you know, the financial incentives from, let's say, arms sale, align with, let's say, their democratic and aspirations for you know, conveying certain values. And to what extent those divergence between economic and social ideals are clashing.
I mean, of course, politics is all about pragmatism. And I think what we're witnessing in the world now is increasing compartmentalization when it comes to how the West is dealing, not just with the Arab region, but also with other countries across the world. So you will find countries that may be in disagreement politically, but that have economic deals that go on. You have incidents like, President Macron of Syria giving President Sisi of Egypt, the highest medal in France, saying because security cooperation matters a lot to France. And this completely disregards the human rights transgressions that are happening, in Egypt. You have the United States and others favoring people who exist in the region, who present themselves as reformists and Democrats, and who are in private actually just as autocratic as anyone. And these because people just look good, so that these regimes, end up being sustained indirectly because the West chooses to engage with people who, between quotation marks, sound like us, and who talk the talk, but actually don't walk the walk. And so I put a lot of responsibility on the West. I'll give you an example from our work on Iraq at Chatham House. The United Kingdom, for example, at the time when the elections were taking place in Iraq in 2018, thought that Abadi would win again, and basically put all their eggs in that basket and spent a lot of resources, supporting Abadi politically, and he did not win the election. And at the time, my colleagues, who work on Iraq were saying, actually, you need to understand that the landscape in Iraq is not as you think. And the response was like, we don't need your analysis because we already know everything there is to know about Iraq. And obviously they were wrong. So there's also a bit of arrogance. And this takes me back to what Joseph said about the importance of linking the intellectuals in the region to the intellectuals outside. It's not just linking them to the intellectuals. The policymakers in the West should listen to these voices in the region. And when these voices say things that are challenging and that make these Western policymakers feel uncomfortable, this is when these voices I think, are most crucial, rather than just always talking to the people who sound like us and make us feel good about ourselves by ticking boxes.
Thank you, Lina. Michele, you have the final words of this webinar. There is one question that is addressed to you if you want to take a stab at it as well. And it reflects on your observation that we're reaching peak oil demand and that there's going to be a lot of financial pressure, especially on oil producing countries, obviously on other countries as well, because you get less investments and development assistance and remittances, but on oil producing countries. So the question is, to what extent might social unrest, when it evolves, maybe it becomes more prevalent in some of these oil-producing countries, or what countries can we expect possibly to feel more pressure and social pressure and possibly protests going forward?
Oh, well, Nader, if I knew that, it's extremely difficult to predict sometimes where protest is going to break out. Usually though, I would say look at countries where there's usually some lead up to it. Usually when we see a major outbreak of protest, you can follow the breadcrumb trail back through some smaller things that happen. So I would say pay attention to the smaller things that happen, the smaller signs, whether they are within the elite, sometimes even within ruling circles, as well as on the popular level. You know, pay attention to these things because they are often paving the way for something bigger. And the last thing I will say is just going back to what Lina was just saying about the West. You know, the problem is, you know, sort of similar in a way to the situation, the 2008 financial crisis, that in which the West became very preoccupied with its own affairs and then was not at all prepared for the outbreak of protest and change and turmoil in the Middle East region starting in 2011. I think we have a similar situation now, where, you know, the West is going to be preoccupied with its own pandemic and post-pandemic recovery, as well as generally, certainly in the United States, wanting to bring down its attention to the Middle East and pay more attention to China and the Asian neighborhood and so forth. And yet, I think that's going to lead government officials in the West to be unprepared for the degree of change, turmoil that's coming to the Middle East region. So my one piece of advice is this: as Westerners look to how they want to change their involvement with the Middle East, be aware that we're going to be changing our involvement with a region that's going to be changing itself, and that this strategy on the part of Europe and the United States, let's just contain everything in the Middle East, North Africa, let's just keep it quiet, you know, because we have other things to worry about, that's not going to work. You know, and so I think, you know, Westerners really need a different mindset in terms of how we can transform our own engagement to make, not to bring about change in the Middle East, North Africa region, but to play a constructive role in a region that will bring about change on its own.
Michele, Lina, Joseph, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. It's been really enlightening, insightful, and judging from the comments that I'm seeing in the Q&A, people are really engaged and appreciate what you had to say. We look forward to seeing you again, hopefully soon, in another webinar. In the meantime, thanks everyone, and thank you to the participants and all the audience, and happy holidays.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.